All right, welcome everyone to week 3 of the 7th annual Open Space Conference. We are thrilled to see some familiar faces from weeks 1 and 2, and welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the webinar today on the Mass Open Space Network website. If you want to turn your camera off, you can do so by pressing this button. Please stay on mute for the entirety of the webinar until the speakers' presentations are complete. If you want to enable live captions, please click here. We will have a Q&A segment after our speakers are done with their presentation, where you will have an opportunity to ask them questions. During the Q&A, please feel free to use the raise hand function to ask a question out loud or type the question into the chat at any point during today's webinar. Lastly, resources from today will be available for viewing on the Mass Open Space Network website. This event is organized in partnership with the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. The conference is funded through the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation's Working Forest Initiative. I want to take a moment to recognize all the organizations that made this possible: the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership, Green Cambridge, and the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. I want to share a few of the resources and opportunities you can find on the Massachusetts Open Space Network website. First, we have a great free resource, the Open Space Handbook, which covers various topics such as land protection tools, stewardship, and several real-life case studies. Additionally, the recordings and resources from webinars 1 and 2, along with information for upcoming events, are available on the website. This is the third in a series of 4 weekly webinars and networking sessions designed to help you think about how your community fits within a larger context. Last week at webinar 2, the social context of your community, we were joined by 140 attendees from across Massachusetts. Today is the climate context of your community. For this webinar, we are joined by 2 incredible speakers. Our first speaker of the day is Melissa Peters. Melissa, a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, is the Director of Community Planning for the Community Development Department at the City of Cambridge, Mass. In her position, she manages a group of planners and urban designers responsible for long-range planning, focusing on comprehensive neighborhood and open space planning. Melissa previously worked for CDM Smith in Chicago and Boston, developing comprehensive neighborhood sustainability and climate change plans for municipalities nationwide. She is an award-winning and passionate planner skilled in creating integrated urban solutions that balance the goals of diverse planning disciplines. We will now be changing the chat settings to message hosts only, so please feel free to message Alex or Julia with any questions for the Q&A, and with any technical questions, you can message the same. So with that, I will pass it on to Melissa.
Great, thank you, Emmy, and let me share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that all right? Excellent. Well, thanks, Emmy, and the Mass Open Space Conference. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to share some recent planning and initiatives the City of Cambridge has been undertaking in regards to our open space planning, and particularly in the context, as per the topic of this discussion, and how we can use our open space resources to mitigate and adapt to growing climate risks. One thing I like to emphasize in our open space planning work is that parks and open spaces are a part of the city's key physical and social infrastructure. They bring people together as opportunities for community building, for play and learning, pride in place, also create active living and public health benefits. And then, of course, the focus for today's conversation, environmental benefits. And as we do our open space planning work, we often think, how can we manage and improve our open space system to realize multiple benefits throughout the city, and particularly paying attention to how those benefits are equitably distributed. And in doing this, our open space planning effort, we've just started an update to our plan. It's called Our Parks, Our Plan Cambridge. And we're looking at open space through 4 key factors: access, resilience, public health, and community. So access is the traditional metric for open space needs assessments. And so this is typically access and distribution. We're certainly looking at the types of open space, but also the access to open space in terms of, can you get there even if it might be within a 10-minute walk? Are there physical barriers separating you from it? And then more and more, we're talking about societal barriers. So do open spaces feel welcoming to all? And how are they designed to ensure that they're not exclusive in their design and practice? We also are looking through a lens of resilience. So we're looking at how open spaces can be used to mitigate against urban heat island, flooding, and we'll talk today about specific strategies we're doing in that regard. But also looking through a lens of public health. And we know that people who live closer to parks and open spaces are healthier, they live more active lifestyles, and also it increases mental health and social well-being. And in all these 3 factors that I just discussed, we're looking at these through an equity lens. So overlaying these through a community demographics perspective, making sure that the benefits of open space, as I discussed previously, are shared by all in the city, with a particular focus on underserved and historically harmed communities. And so what we've done is we've created indexes for each of these 4 factors. And it helps us to, when we want to look at a particular factor closely at an individual basis, we can look to see where in the city there's a particular need for park access, or for resilience, where we have low tree canopy or hotter heat island, or where our community is more diverse and has less access per capita to open space. And then we also can layer that into a composite, which actually tells a really interesting story. For those that are familiar with Cambridge, in the northwest corner of the city is what we call our Alewife Neighborhood. And from a park access perspective, they're very well suited to open space. They are accessible to 2 of the largest open spaces in the city, Fresh Pond Reservation and Danahy Park. But when you look at a resilience perspective, they actually have a lot of urban form that tends to be impervious pavement, lack of a street grid, undeveloped areas. That's one of our areas that's still under development, but hasn't benefited from kind of the strong knit canopy and residential fabric of the other parts of the city. So as a whole, that tells a different story when you start to compound those together. And so it's important to notice things on an individual basis, but also together and how they interact with these mutual benefits. And so for today, wanted to talk specifically about how we've been looking at open spaces as a resilience opportunity, and wanted to pause here and just talk about the previous work to date that's kind of has led up to the city's work. We, in 2015, started a climate change vulnerability assessment. We identified key risks that the city would be facing: extreme heat, extreme rain, sea level rise, and storm surge. Understanding those vulnerabilities was important to then create a climate change preparedness and resiliency plan in 2017. That's been followed up by additional plans, the Envision Cambridge plan, which is the city's comprehensive citywide planning document that looks at development at a whole scale, and additional issues of housing, economy, open space, urban form. but it does include recommendations around climate and environment in a more sustainable urban form. And then a lot of work recently in 2020 on our urban forest master plan. The city has been losing tree canopy significantly in efforts to date how to increase canopy and what the challenges that are unique to Cambridge because of our dense built out environment. And then now obviously we're embarking on this new open space plan update. So I'll start first with kind of describing the risks and vulnerabilities that Cambridge is facing. The first is extreme heat. On the map on the left shows how an average 90-degree day feels like in different parts of the city. And you can see that areas that are in red tend to be the areas with lower tree canopy and more impervious surface. And then of course, we all know that heat is increasing, and the number of days over 90 degrees could triple by 2030 in our projections, and there could be more than 2 months by 2070 that are over 90 degrees. So what does this mean for our infrastructure and our physical stress on cooling systems and also safety of individuals? And because obviously canopy and impervious surface relate to extreme heat, I wanted to just show some mapping we've done at the city level to show where there are opportunities for additional tree plantings and rethinking redevelopment. We certainly, to my point about equity previously, tree canopy is not equitably distributed throughout the city. The areas of the city that are more diverse, low income, tend to have less tree canopy. And so as we think about redesign of our parks and open spaces, certainly when we look at these maps to see where there are opportunities, where it is needed the most. Secondly, flooding. This map shows the projected 100-year flood in 2070. And this includes both precipitation-driven flood events, but also sea level storm surge. This was with no action taking. And of course, we know that flooding occurs today as well, but understanding where the future risk is helps us in planning. And so how do we understanding these risks, we think about what are the opportunities for addressing these challenges. And of course, I'm talking specifically about the role of open space today, but because we live in a dense urban environment, I try to always expand the definition of open space, and it's not the traditional just open fields and parks, because if we're looking only through the lens of those, we're really limiting our opportunity to implement change. So it's looking at open space, but also on the parcel level, how can we encourage private development to have more open space on site, to have more cooling on their sites, how we incorporate stormwater or cooling infrastructure underneath our parks or other streets and so forth. And then lastly, focusing on people. And we haven't talked much about social resilience, but a key part of climate change resilience is making sure that people are prepared for climate change and have the social networks and capabilities to deal with hardships. And so when we think about people, it's like, do they have a social network? How can we bring people together and build community? And a key role of what we do in the community planning division at the City of Cambridge is thinking through how public space and parks bring people together. To my point about not only looking at the city's open spaces, I wanted to show some mapping of the existing open space network in the city. So on a per capita basis, we don't have a lot of open space for our densely populated city. About 12% of our land area is publicly accessible open space, but we do have a relatively good access in terms of people who are within walking distance to a public space. And because we're built out and land is relatively unavailable, and when it is available, very expensive, and there are competing uses, it really limits our opportunity for new open space and acquisition. But if we start to think of our open space network as including our streets and paths, that gets us to 40% of the city's land area. And then certainly if we think about how we can regulate private development on the parcel level, we obviously have more opportunity for affecting change. So I'll talk about 6 key strategies that we've incorporated into our planning efforts that range from increasing tree canopy to green infrastructure and flood storage. And then I'll also highlight some success stories of how we've done those to date. So the first strategy is to increase tree canopy on public and private property. So again, we can easily park streets and city parking lots. Those are relatively easy to increase tree plantings on and vegetation. That's kind of a first step, and we have the mapping to support that. We also, when we do get new opportunities for new parks, looking at those maps and densely planting them with an urban forest and heavy vegetation. And then, of course, the more difficult thing is how do we plant on private property or encourage planting on private property, and particularly prevent the cutting down of trees. So in the past couple of years, the city has greatly enhanced our tree protection ordinance. It's much more difficult to remove a tree. So the diameter of a tree that can be, that's considered significant is a much lower threshold. And there's a very significant fee for if you do have to lose a significant tree. We also are continually increasing the open space requirements for private development. That's obviously a discussion around trade-offs with the public around massing and height and density of buildings, but certainly something we want more of. And also considering charging fees to developers to go into an open space fund so that we can use our citywide open space needs assessment to fund improvements in areas of the city that aren't experiencing development directly. And then recently the city, as part of the Resilience Cambridge planning process, had a climate resilience task force that recommended a cool factor zoning ordinance that I'll talk about in a few slides. But first I want to highlight an opportunity where we were able to get a new park in East Cambridge. This is Triangle Park near Kendall Square on Land Boulevard in Binney. And because this area is the neighborhood with the lowest tree canopy, it was an opportunity to try an urban forest and create an urban wild in the city, a first of its kind. So it's currently under construction. The design is 1 acre of dense urban forest plantings, and we're very excited about using this as a case study. And for the cool factor zoning, this will not adopted into law yet, is a recommendation that instead of just requiring private developments to increase open space and control permeability standards, really looking at a performance-based system where you would get points for shading. So this could be tree canopy or architectural shade canopies, cool services, so high SRI pavement, plantings, and you get more points depending on how impactful it is on cooling. And so this is something that we're excited about moving forward through the zoning process. Another strategy, of course, is reducing impervious area. We recently passed a green roof ordinance that will require green roofs of 80% of available roof area for any development that's greater than 25,000 square feet. There's an example picture here of our rooftop garden in Kendall Square. And of course, looking at opportunities to revegetate paved areas and parking lots. And if you can't add more vegetation, this parking lot at Springfield Street and Inman Square shows an example of a high SRI paving. So that white paving to help combat the urban heat island effect. We're also looking at kind of a policy level in terms of in our development requirements, reducing the minimum parking requirements so that parking does not take up space on lots that could be used as open space. And of course, in all of our infrastructure projects, our street redesigns, again, doesn't always have to be a park redesign. How can we incorporate green infrastructure, raised planters, bioretention, porous pavement to help in cooling? And so there's a lot of strategies in Resilient Cambridge and how to create cool corridors on some of our major thoroughways. Of course, increased flood storage and conveyance. At the new Toomey Park in East Cambridge, this is one of 3 parks in East Cambridge that we were able to get through developer negotiations in East Cambridge with Alexandria Real Estate in exchange for density bonus. And underneath.
Thank you. Oh, the bunny too.
There's some background noise.
Yeah, the bunny has an eye.
There we go. Underneath this field is stormwater infiltration system. So how we can use open spaces, not only on top of them with plantings and vegetation, but also thinking about the infrastructure underground. We're also redeveloping our Tobin School in Alewife. And as part of this project, we were able to incorporate a 1.2 million gallon underground stormwater storage tank, in addition to a lot of green infrastructure. And in a similar vein, this is a stormwater tank under a public parking lot. So again, open spaces, well, traditionally viewed as green open spaces, expanding that definition to open space, open to the air, parking lots, streets. How can we make our built environment more sustainable and climate resilient? And then a more traditional success story, there's a 3.4 acre constructed wetline in the Alewife area that provides a lot of flood mitigation and water quality benefits. And so in addition to tree plantings and light colored pervious surfaces, also thinking about the programming and the design of these public spaces. So how can we have water play to help cool people off in the summer, shade structures, canopies, thinking about how to design to make it more comfortable for people. And then lastly, want to again emphasize the importance of social resilience and how improving access to open space is a resilience strategy, and that creating new parks in areas that would benefit from community building or have less access is important, but also redesigning existing parks to meet community needs of that particular area or community. Improving connectivity. Again, in Cambridge, we don't have a lot of opportunity for new open space, but how can we help people get to the open space that we have? And so that's, physical barriers, easements through private property, et cetera. And then lastly, we've been doing a lot of work on privately owned public spaces. So about 30% of Cambridge's publicly accessible open space is privately owned. And not all privately owned public space are created equal. Some are designed with a certain clientele in mind. Some have different regulations on hours of operation, gates, closures. So we've been really rethinking what are the design guidelines we would require developers to incorporate into making these inclusive and welcoming spaces, and that there's a consistent branding to indicate to folks that this is a space for you. And so that's an ongoing challenge, but important consideration. So thank you so much. That's my presentation, and I'm excited to hear Josh's presentation and answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Our Just a quick reminder, folks, if you can remember to stay muted during the presentations, that would be great. We just want to reduce as much distraction for our speakers as we can, and also make sure everyone can get the best experience out of listening to them. So our next speaker is Josh Rapp. Josh is a conservation scientist for Mass Audubon, where he leads the Forest Resilience Program. This includes managing projects that develop and promote resilient forests and enhance carbon storage through forest stewardship planning, carbon sequestration, and ensuring that forest management practices are appropriate for changing climate conditions to safeguard water, wildlife habitat, and forest carbon stocks. Josh holds a Bachelor of Science in Geology from Duke University, a Master's of Science in Forestry from the University of Vermont, and a PhD in Biology from Wake Forest University. He has researched forests and climate change for over 15 years in systems as diverse as the tropical Andes of South America, the Northern Rockies, and New England. Take it away, Josh.
Thank you, Emmy, and thanks to Melissa for that great talk on the work they're doing in Cambridge. My talk is going to be a little bit more focused on rural areas, although certainly some of the things that Melissa talked about in terms of tree planting and urban forests would fall under what the banner of climate smart forestry that I'm going to speak about. Share my screen. Start. So as Emmy said, mentioned, I'm going to be talking about climate smart forestry today, and really that means thinking about forestry with climate in mind, particularly climate resilience and storing carbon. I'm going to start my talk today by defining climate smart forestry in a little bit more depth and hopefully convince you why it's important. And then I'm going to go on and talk about some specific climate smart practices that can be employed in forest lands, whether those be private or open space. And then talk about some resources for implementing those practices, and should have plenty of time for questions and discussion after that. I want to first acknowledge that there are multiple values and goals associated with forests, a few of which are highlighted here. While climate resilience and carbon storage can be goals in and of themselves, climate smart forestry can also be implemented along with any of these other goals. To get a little more specific about what climate smart forestry is, it's about maintaining forest health in a changing climate, while at the same time sequestering and storing carbon in order to mitigate climate change. That is, to lessen the impacts of climate change by keeping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I'll get into more detail on all of these. So why should we practice climate smart forestry when we're thinking about managing forest lands? Simply put, climate change is impacting our forests now. We don't really have a choice not to pay attention to these impacts. And as I mentioned, forests can also be part of the solution to climate change. So I'll start with talking about forests as a solution to climate change. This figure here shows in the orange line shows the trend in temperature over the past 120 years. And it's been trending up, and that is due to the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The green and red areas show potential trajectories for temperature over the next 80 years, depending on how aggressively and completely humans respond to changing climate and work to lower emissions or don't. Either way, we're expecting temperatures to continue to increase over the next several decades, which means impacts on our forests. However, by reducing emissions or sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we can lower the impact of climate change, and forests have a role in doing that. This slide shows the carbon cycle as it impacts forests, or as it includes forest. And I want to focus on two aspects of this, two definitions. One is for carbon sequestration, the other is for carbon storage. Carbon sequestration is the process by which plants use sunlight to capture CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it into plant biomass, which includes wood, leaves, roots, and ultimately feeds into the rest of the forest ecosystem. Carbon storage is a state. It's how much carbon is retained long-term in the forest. So you hear those terms sometimes used interchangeably, but they're actually distinct. Sequestration means taking carbon in the form of CO2 out of the atmosphere, whereas carbon storage is keeping it locked up. This figure illustrates both of these both sequestration and storage, as well as emission of CO2 back to the atmosphere. As young forests grow, they sequester carbon. Older forests also sequester carbon, but at diminishing rates. And they do store large amounts of carbon. When trees die, that carbon goes back to the atmosphere, but decomposition can take a long time. Carbon in wood products may also be stored for centuries if they end up in a house or other long-lived product. And even if the wood that might be harvested doesn't last that long, substituting wood, which is a renewable resource for materials such as concrete or steel or for fossil fuels, can have a benefit to the atmosphere because it's keeping that other carbon out of the atmosphere. This figure, developed by Paul Catanzaro at UMass and Tony D'Amato at the University of Vermont, is helpful for understanding what happens to carbon in a forest. The numbers at the center of the clock show years since the initiation of a forest stand, so since it began growing, although this is only a rough approximation of how long succession takes and can vary depending on a number of factors. The yellow ring shows how species that make up the forest change over time, going from species that thrive in full sun to those that in the early part of forest succession to those that can grow up in the shade of a full canopy later on. The green ring depicts carbon sequestration rates, with darker green showing higher rates of carbon being sequestered. Rates are low at first when the forest just begins to grow, but once the young trees have grown enough that the canopy closes in, sequestration rates quickly reach a maximum as trees grow rapidly. The rate declines over time as some trees lose the race for light, and their death and decomposition begins to offset some of the growth of the remaining trees. The outer ring shows carbon storage, which continues to increase over time if the stand is not disturbed. However, forest succession is not the only influence on carbon stocks. Forest stressors, including those from climate change, can lower sequestration rates and reduce stocks. And how we manage forests matters too. When trees are harvested, this lowers carbon stocks in the short term as you remove wood from the forest, but depending on how those forest harvests are designed, can increase resiliency, sequestration, and stocking over the longer term if done carefully. The next couple slides, I'll describe some of the impacts climate change is having on forests and which can influence rates of sequestration and the amount of carbon stored in forests. Some changes from climate are impact forests directly. Bigger, more intense storms and heavier precipitation can damage stands, lead to flooding and erosion. Flip side of this is that there can be longer periods of drought between precipitation events, which can result in tree dieback and mortality, as well as weaken trees and make them susceptible to other disturbances, such as the ones on the next slide. And in coastal areas, sea level rise can directly impact forests. There's increasingly forests dying from sea level rise and becoming ghost forests along the eastern seaboard. Other impacts are less direct. Insect, pest, and forest pathogen outbreaks can be worse in a warmer climate. Hemlock woolly adelgid, which is shown here, is limited by cold temperatures, so can kill hemlock trees more rapidly as temperatures warm. Invasive plants often benefit from warmer temperatures and can invade when other disturbances affect forests. A combination of drought and dead trees can increase the occurrence of wildfire. And finally, all these impacts together can conspire to limit the habitat of some tree species while increasing habitat suitability in the region for others. So you get a shifting of what species of trees make up our forests. I'll now shift into talking about the specific climate smart practices that can help grow resilience into our forests and maintain and increase carbon. Conservation and forestry professionals have been working together to identify and define a list of forest practices that improve forest resilience and increase the amount of carbon stored across the landscape. The development of this list has been a collaborative effort. Some of the organizations involved are listed here, but many more stakeholders have been involved. This slide, which I borrowed from Laura Marks at the Nature Conservancy, depicts the process of developing the list of climate smart practices that I'll share in subsequent slides. The project team started with a review of the scientific literature to identify potential practices, put that initial list through a filter of the ecological and management context for the region that we live in, and then asked a group of experts to evaluate and refine the list. The end of result was this list. I'll describe these practices over the next several slides, so you don't need to read everything on this slide. Here, I'll just point out that many of these practices have both carbon and adaptation benefits, and that none of the carbon practices are maladaptive if implemented in the right circumstances. Whether there is an A in the adaptation column or a C in the carbon column, just it reflects what lens we were looking at these practices for during the development of these lists. The first set of practices really focuses on keeping the forests we have. This includes protecting forests, to reduce or eliminate conversion of forest to non-forest. So approaches like fee ownership by conservation organizations who protect that land, or conservation restrictions are examples of protecting forests. Another aspect of keeping the forest we have is responding to disturbance. Because we have so many different threats to forests, when we have a big disturbance, it's sometimes necessary to restore forests. And so responding quickly can help us do that. In some areas, it's appropriate to grow new forests. So reforestation, planting forests in areas that may have historically had forests but don't have forests now. So the picture here shows a planting project at the Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary in East Hampton that Mass Audubon manages, and we're re-establishing some floodplain forest in that region. But there's other approaches to planting trees, some that Melissa described would fall under greening developed areas. So planting trees along streets and in yards and in other open space. And then there's planting trees where forest already exists, but are either under stock, so don't have as many trees as they could have, or the trees that are there are not particularly well adapted to a future climate. Another set of practices could fall under a heading of intentional passive management. And the intentional part is important. Just sort of neglecting the forest and hoping it takes care of itself may work if that forest is healthy, but it may not if that forest is not healthy. So in terms of intentional passive management, that means identifying areas that have strong ecological integrity, that may provide refugia for the future, and that are in good shape. And then intentionally monitoring those sites over time to make sure that things remain in good shape and a management action is not needed. Another kind of shorter time frame approach to passive management is just increasing the time between harvests in a managed stand. Another set of practices are reducing other stressors. So for in stands that are being managed for timber harvest or other goals such as recreation, that have trails, for instance, doing best management practices that minimize impacts to water resources, minimize erosion, and impacts to soils are important. Doing things like addressing invasive species, which can choke out native trees and seedlings and saplings, as well as protecting the young trees from too much deer browse, which is an issue in much of Massachusetts. Finally, there's a set of practices that could fall into an active management bucket, where we're going in and actually removing some trees in order to either harvest those trees for wood products or create wildlife habitat or build resilience into a forest. So if you have an unhealthy forest, you may design a harvest that removes the unhealthy trees, gives the trees that are more healthy more space to grow, and so that they become healthier over time. Or you may need to transition a forest from what it is now to one that will better fit the climate of the future. That's a little more of an experimental approach these days, but it may become more important as climate continues to change. And then the last two practices there, create gaps to promote regeneration, retain more carbon in a thinning. Those are particular practices of doing harvests, but doing them in such a way that within 20 years, you actually have more carbon than when you started. So designing harvests that don't reduce the amount of carbon over that time scale. So in the last part of my talk today, I'll talk about opportunities for actually implementing these practices. It really all starts with a plan. You need a plan. Forests are complex ecosystems that grow and change over decades and centuries. And so having a plan for the long-term management of forests is important. And so I'll talk a bit today about the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation's Forest Stewardship Program, which provides cost share to private individuals, private organizations, including conservation organizations and municipalities, for getting forest stewardship plans. And these these can be a standard forest stewardship plan. There's one that's particularly for wildlife habitat, and we've been working with DCR and other partners to develop one that is really focused on climate resilience and mitigation. And that is launching now, or in the last couple of weeks, we've been just beginning to train foresters in this new plan type. And so I'll talk a bit about that, and then I'll talk a bit about implementing those plans. And so I kind of started this slide, already talking about this slide. DCR provides cost share. There's currently a standard plan, a bird plan. We're launching the climate plan, and that will focus on on forest resilience and carbon mitigation. And there's resources, a number of resources related to this on the DCR website. And I can also talk a bit more about this. Really starts with understanding the goals of whoever's stewarding that and controls that forest. This is the list of goals that is not exclusive, but it's a list of goals that landowners can consider. The ones highlighted in green are the ones that are really the focus of this new climate plan. And there's a booklet that describes what these goals are. One thing I like to stress is that climate smart forestry doesn't have to come at the expense of any of these other goals. It can be practiced along with other goals landowners might have for their land. In addition to the goals of whoever's managing the forest, it's important to understand the forest itself and to assess the climate vulnerability of that forest. And to understand how the impact of climate change may affect the goals one has for the property. I spoke earlier about the general impacts climate change can have on forests. The impacts on a particular property or forest stand will depend on the specifics of that tract of land. A property with steep slopes may be more susceptible to erosion, for instance, or a particular mix of tree species may be more or less susceptible to insect pests or pathogens. And doing a climate vulnerability assessment is kind of a circular process. There's not, you start in a particular place where you need to define your goals, assess climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. You evaluate your goals in light of those vulnerabilities, and then you identify management actions. And then you continue to monitor and potentially redefine goals, reassess climate vulnerability over time. Monitoring is a key piece of this, particularly when we're thinking about climate change. And as the climate environment changes, goals and vulnerabilities may also change. This work is typically done by a forester, often a private consulting forester who can help landowners think through this process and develop a plan. A forester will come up with management recommendations. The table here shows an example of management recommendations for a particular stand in a town forest. So you end up with a bunch of recommendations. Then you need to figure out, well, how do you get those done? In some cases, if there's a harvest involved, the sale of logs might cover additional costs of stewardship. In other cases where there's not a commercial harvest involved, there are a number of programs that can help pay for climate smart practices, and I'll describe some of those. There are several state grants that can be useful in this realm. The Urban and Community Forestry Challenge grants are particularly focused on urban forests. So the urban canopy, tree planting, and care for urban forests. Community forest stewardship implementation grants are really focused on town forests and watershed areas that have a forest stewardship plan. And then municipal vulnerability preparedness, or MVP grants, can also be used. They have a much broader range of things you can use them for, but they can also be used for implementing climate smart management. And I'll describe a project in the next slide, where Mass Audubon has been working with several partners, including the ones I showed earlier, to design what we're calling the Forest Climate Resilience Program using MVP funds. So we've had 2 grants to 2 towns within the Mohawk Trail Woodland Partnership region, which is the northwest corner of Massachusetts, to develop this program. And we're currently assisting towns to get either a brand new forest stewardship climate plan or an update to an existing plan to make it a climate plan. And we have about 7 towns getting those on their properties right now. And we anticipate trying to get additional MVP funding to implement those plans, to create demonstration sites on town forest land. This is an approach that doesn't need to be unique to this region, this particular geography, and Mass Audubon would be more than happy to talk with folks in other municipalities about doing something similar in terms of thinking about how to get forest stewardship climate plans and implementing those plans using MVP funds. Finally, there's a few other, there's a number of other programs. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has several grant programs that are primarily for private landowners, but are good funding for a lot of these practices. I won't really go into details on these, but that's another source, not available generally to municipalities, but is available to private landowners. A lot of folks are interested in forest carbon, have heard about forest carbon markets, are interested in offset projects. Carbon has become about a commodity essentially, and you can sell carbon that's standing in the trees in the forest instead of cutting those trees down and selling timber. And so that has an obvious benefit that it's aligned with climate smart forestry to begin with, and it provides a stream of revenue that can be reinvested in additional stewardship actions. I won't go into details on how these work now, but Mass Audubon can provide free technical assistance to municipalities who are interested in exploring this idea more. And then I wanted to mention one other program. There's a number of, so traditionally, and traditional is a relative term in carbon markets because they've only been around 10 or 15 years, but early carbon projects were only available for really large ownerships, several thousand acres or more. But there's a number of new programs coming out for smaller landowners. And some of these are mostly available to private landowners, but some may also be able to open to municipal land in the future. The Family Forest Carbon Program is one of these, currently only available to private landowners, but it pays for implementation of specific practices in exchange for essentially the carbon rights to the land. The program then sells that carbon on carbon market, but uses the proceeds to pay landowners for doing practices rather than specifically for the carbon on their land. And that has some benefits in terms of making it more feasible for landowners to get involved in that. But there are other small landowner programs as well. And that brings me to the end of my slides. And I am interested in taking questions along with the other one. So let me stop my share.
There we go. Thank you so much, Josh. All right, so we are just about ready to move into the Q&A segment of this webinar. During this time, please feel free to use the raise hand function in the reactions, and I will call on you to unmute so you can ask your question out loud to our speakers, or you can also type the questions into the chat, which has been changed to being able to message everybody. So we're going to begin with some of our written questions that were sent during the presentations, and then we will move on to participants who raised their hand. So please be respectful of our fellow conference attendees, and please don't unmute unless you have been called on. All right, so our first question is from Marianne, and it's for Melissa. And they asked, where can we find the methodology used in Cambridge's open space assessment? And they said it's very impressive.
Thanks, Marianne. We, for now, since we're still finalizing the report, it will be in the appendix, but feel free to reach out to me at the City of Cambridge and Peters at cambridgema.gov, and I'm happy to share the methodology.
Awesome. And next we have a question for Josh. And this is a question about DCR. And they asked, doesn't a DCR grant need a minimum of 10 acres for a forest plan assist grant? And the town must have an up-to-date open space and rec plan to qualify. And they were just asking, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, for a cost share for a forest stewardship plan, there's a minimum of 10 acres. If you don't ask for it, if you pay for it yourself, then there's no minimum acreage. But for a cost share, there is a minimum of 10 acres. And for towns, yeah, you do need an open space plan.
And another question for Josh from Tom. How do wildfires and controlled burns play into forest planning?
Good question. So obviously that's a disturbance that, wildfires are a disturbance that can impact our forests, and there are ways to manage forests so that they're less susceptible to forest fires. In general, in Massachusetts, forest fires are not a huge threat. In most of our state, toward the southeast, that's a little bit less true. And there's certain types of forests in the rest of the state that are actually dependent on forest fires. And so in those cases, controlled burns can be very helpful in terms of both maintaining a particular forest type and preventing larger fires in the future. And so certainly controlled burns can be one of the management actions that you could include in a forest management plan. Hope that answers the question. There certainly can be incorporated into that and into forest management planning.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. And now a question for Melissa from Joanna. What strategies do you have for expanding the mission of an open space, sustainability, or conservation commission to prevent cutting of trees on private land? And what is the diameter of a significant tree?
Great question. So in our municipal ordinance, we have a tree planting ordinance and removal ordinance that lays out the diameter and other specifications on mitigation. I don't know the actual diameter off the top of my head. I'd have to look that up, but it has been significantly decreased from what it was in the past.
All right, and now I'll call on Karen. Your hand was raised.
Hi, thanks. Question for Josh. You said that carbon is a commodity now. Who do you sell your carbon? Who's buying the carbon rights? So who is the carbon market and how do they benefit?
Yeah, so there's one important distinction is that there's a compliance market, which is really covered right now in terms of who's buying forest carbon, really only covers California and Quebec, and that is there are entities in those regions that are required to keep their emissions under a certain cap. That cap goes down over time, but they can buy offsets for a small portion of that cap, and those are typically are going to be polluting industries, often energy industry in those. And then there's also a voluntary market where corporations, individuals, anyone really can buy carbon to offset their own emissions. And that the market there is much broader. It the biggest buyers tend to be the biggest corporations that have made sustainability goals and have made commitments to the amount of emissions they will how they account for their emissions, and those include organizations like Amazon and Microsoft and Disney, Google, like really big companies. But individuals can also, buy carbon offsets to offset, say, a flight you take somewhere. And there are outlets there are sort of middlemen who package offsets for that market as well. So it really depends on the project where those credits get sold.
Awesome. And a question for Melissa from the chat. What role will native trees and plants play in the various aspects of the plan? Will Cambridge be following Somerville's lead with the recent ordinance that was passed? Will developers be required to have a certain percentage of plants be natives?
Great question. We don't have anything formally adopted or mandated yet, but that seems to be the direction of the recommendation of the plan. And also follow suit with our arborist tree planting recommendations. I did, if I could go back to the previous question, I was able to quickly look up the diameter. It changed from 8 to 6 diameters, which is now protected. And the analysis shows that that's an increase of about 50% of trees that are protected now.
It's really great. I'm going to call on Sarah Freeman next. Hand was raised.
Sorry,
Sarah,
it took me a
sorry, go
minute
ahead.
to unmute. Hi, this question can be for either speaker. Between conservation land and private land, there's a category in my mind of state agencies other than DCR, for example. If they have a property that is almost completely paved, like a lot of surface parking built, but they're doing a redevelopment, are you aware of any goals or guidelines? Like Melissa said, green roofs are what, 80%, or are there any goals to not repeat that total impervious treatment?
I can go first. I mean, certainly that is a challenge in our state-owned agencies. We do collaborate with them and share our goals in terms of regulations that they're subject to. It's more difficult. So but there is obviously a review process, which the city is a stakeholder along with residents and others to encourage sustainability goals. I don't know any state agencies' particular goals specifically.
Yeah, I'm also not aware of specific goals, but I do know that the state, led by the Executive Office of Energy and Environment, is going through the planning or the planning for the climate roadmap bill, which was passed, and that includes making goals and recommendations for reducing emissions and improving, and along the way improving many environmental things. So I would think that would be something they would consider, but it's certainly something that citizens can ask that they consider in that process.
How would they do that? How would a citizen submit that kind of feedback? Do you have to wait till a project is under review, or what I'd like to see is the state to get ahead of that and state it as a goal?
Yeah, I know there's there's been a series of public meetings around different aspects of that plan around the climate roadmap. I've participated in ones on natural and working lands, but there are ones in other areas. And so there's a process associated with that for submitting comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll call on, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Daniel Leahy. You have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. My question is for Melissa. That was a great presentation, Melissa. I live in a community of 948 people, so it was great to see a presentation on what you can do in the urban environment. I also liked the slide where you showed that you had 12% open space, public open space, but when you included the roads and streets and paths, you were able to get to 46%. That was very impressive. You made it look easy, but I know it's not easy to do what you're doing. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges? You've got all these stakeholders, right? The communities, the neighborhoods, the developers, the city council, the politics of it all. Could you talk a little bit about how you're making all this happen?
Sure. Thanks for the compliment, and happy to give a sneak peek into the challenges. I always, my other part of my job is doing comprehensive planning, and which obviously balances multiple planning disciplines. And so I often say when I'm just doing open space or a singular topic, it's smooth sailing and easy. But certainly to your point, I think the biggest challenge in Cambridge is just the competing demand for land. And when there is available land available, what the competing priorities are for that. So in Cambridge, like not unlike most communities, affordable housing is front and center. And so there's, the community tends to be diametrically opposed between you're either for housing or for open space. Of course, that's not the case. And we need them both. And so kind of dealing with those advocates, creating a balanced solution. I always try to bring things to the citywide level. I think when people get so caught up on a particular site, they forget what they may prefer at a citywide perspective, or if it didn't impact them directly. And so just reminding people what our shared goals and visions are. I think in terms of regulating private development in Cambridge, we do ask a lot of our developer community. And there's certainly, we run development pro formas to see how much we can extract from developers. And so can we increase inclusionary housing? Can we require green roofs, environmental performance, more open space? What density would be needed to exchange for that? There's always that conversation of how that interplays with the built form and the community's comfort in density and development.
Great, thank you.
Our next question is a question from the chat from Laura for Josh. Can you address the carbon storage of soil in the forest system? You said the amount of carbon sequesters tapers at the tree's age, I think, and I've learned the value is on the largest trees in their soil systems. So asking for clarification there. And in addition, can you address the problem of massive amounts of forest being clear cut for solar farms?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a few different pieces in there. One, the question about kind of where the carbon is in terms of the largest trees do have the largest amount of carbon in terms within a forest. There's also, I think it's helpful to separate trees and forests for a second. If you imagine a tree that's growing by itself in an open area, in a field, in a park, along a road, that tree will continue to grow quickly over time because it has plenty of space to spread out its canopy, and the size of that canopy is really directly related to how fast it grows. And if it has plenty of space for its canopy, it can keep growing really, really fast. And so large trees can continue to grow fast over time and sequester more and more carbon. However, if you put that same tree in a forest where it starts to bump up against the canopies of other trees, that rate is going to slow down over time because it doesn't have the space to spread out and continue to increase its canopy. In fact, because the trunk of the tree is continuing to grow, the same size canopy often has to support a much larger and larger trunk as it goes, as the tree grows. And so the sequestration rate of the forest as a whole slows over time because of that competition. So that's one piece in there. But you're right that most of the carbon is in the largest trees. Soil carbon also is really important, and it depends on the forest type, but it's often there's often as much or more carbon in the soil as there is above ground in the trees. So that's an important point. In terms of the forest being lost for solar farms, that's a big issue right now. The last edition of Losing Ground, which is a publication that Mass Audubon puts out, estimated that 1/4 of the forest being lost to development were being lost to solar farms. And so it's a significant amount of the forest that's being lost is going to solar farms. It's a really challenging conundrum because we need both solar and forests. And so how do we figure out how to site solar in a way that's not impacting our forests? And I think that is something we have to figure out as a society.
Great, thank you. Andrea, we have your question in the chat, but I also see your hands raised. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, or if you prefer for me to read it, either works.
Yes, thank you. By the way, great presentations, and I appreciate it. And I have a question for each of you. For Melissa, I live in the western part of the state, and one of the things that we've been experiencing around the tree canopy is that most of our property is privately owned, and insurers for home insurance are now saying to homeowners, cut down your trees because they're a liability for storm damage. And as a result, we really want to make sure that we don't have to pay out great amounts. So we've actually had some homeowners who've almost clear cut their property. I sit on the Conservation Commission, so when it impacts conservation land, we're able to have a say in that and talk about handling it, replacing it, doing something. So I'm wondering if other parts of the state are experiencing anything of that sort, and if so, how do you handle that issue? And my question for Josh has to do with biomass. In one of your beginning slides, you were using forests as a biomass source. And one of the things that we've been very clear about is that biomass from forested wood or harvested wood is not a really good renewable source of energy. So it really shouldn't be considered a renewable energy source. It takes much too long to grow. So I was wondering, start with you, Melissa, on the homeowners and the liability issue, and then turn to Josh.
Great question. And that's certainly problematic. And we do see that similarly in Cambridge, where there are reasons or defined reasons in our ordinance of what is a reasonable reason to take down a tree. And we haven't included liability, but I understand the strain that causes on homeowners. I think in the chat, your question expanded on what are options the city can do to help ease that financial burden on homeowners so that's not the option they take. I don't know specifics. I would say broadly, there could be grant opportunities. I do know Massachusetts has an anti-aid law on the books, which essentially allows cities to pass money to individuals or property owners as a benefit. The way in some programs we've gotten around that is if we clearly identified what the public benefit would be. So we could give money to a homeowner to save trees on their property, raise electrical equipment for resilience, and we're trying to make the argument there's of the public benefit of that. So the financial benefit is going to that particular person. How does it avoid the anti-aid clause? And so, while I don't know the specifics of that, that's something that you might want to look into.
Well, I can address that other question. Andrea, you bring up a really good issue there. I think there's three things that are true, and I didn't highlight the one that what you just highlighted, so I like to talk about that. One is that you know, in our part of the world with our current climate, our soils, trees are renewable. They do grow back if you cut, you know, something. Forest grows back if you cut it down. So it's renewable in that sense. You can substitute wood for other products, and depending on how you do that, it can be a climate benefit. And there's been some interesting research around that. Biomass is a place where that's not so clear that that's a good thing. And I agree. And the reason is, as you alluded to, is that trees take a long time to grow back, and we are in a climate emergency. We need to be reducing our emissions now, and so we need to be very careful about what strategies we take. And biomass is a tricky one, because it in theory you should be able to offset, kind of substitute out for fossil fuels that's coming out of the ground. We don't want to be burning those. In theory, you know, if you think over centuries, trees are a renewable resource. If we use more biomass than fossil fuel, that might be a good thing. But we're in a point now where if you cut a mature forest down just for biomass and then expect that to be a positive, it's going to take a century or more for that to be a positive thing. And we need to be reducing emissions sooner than that. So I do agree with you that the biomass is not a great fit for a climate smart action. And that slide you alluded to, maybe I need to find it. It includes biomass in that slide, but that's not a great use for wood. If it can be used for something else, the balance is a little bit different if you're using if you're burning wood for both heat and electricity and doing some cogeneration, but we don't have a lot of good examples of that.
Yeah, we've just been fighting a biomass plant out here in Western Mass. It's been, we call it the zombie project. And so
there's also there's also a lot of environmental justice issues with biomass plants, because they tend to get situated, sited in places where the pollution can be a real problem.
Thank you. Our next question is for Melissa. Is PV solar to be allowed under the green roof requirement for buildings over 25,000 square feet?
Great question. So the green roof ordinance that was recently passed was a citizen-led zoning petition, and obviously got a lot of citizen support and council support to its eventual adoption. One of the cautionary notes that the city staff said was that how that would compete with solar, and that while the cool factor zoning that I discussed briefly in the presentation, that would be an opportunity where you could get points for multiple or different types of technologies on the rooftop. So it's a really good question. Yeah, obviously, if they have to use the space for roof, they can't do that for something else. And we do know that some locations are better suited for different technologies and certain structures, especially if it's an existing building that's being rehabbed. It may not work as well for green roofs. So it's a great consideration and recognition of the challenges and wanting to advance community benefits, but making sure we don't limit the opportunities for solutions that may not work in all cases.
Great. This is a question for Josh. How do you find a forester with a focus on climate smart forest management?
Yeah, good question. This is a new program, this climate forestry program that's working through DCR that's creating this forest stewardship climate plan. So we're just training the first foresters now. Once they've completed that training and go through a couple other steps, they'll be certified in this climate smart forestry. There are some foresters now that are already very knowledgeable, but once this program gets off the ground, there'll be a certification and there'll be a list of foresters who have that certification. That's not available yet, but will be in this next year. And that will be available either through DCR or the Mass Woods website.
All right, we have about 7 minutes left for Q&A, so I'm just going to continue asking chat questions because we have a lot of questions coming in. So this one is for Melissa. Could you share the tree moratorium language and provide best guidance on replicating that in other cities?
You're referring to the tree protection ordinance, I imagine. Yeah, happy to share that. I can put it in the chat right now. And particularly our Department of Public Works oversaw kind of the ordinance process. So I can certainly also get you in touch with folks who are having more specifics on the process and the mechanisms.
Also, for anyone wondering, any resources that are sent in the chat will be available on the Mass Open Space Network website. So don't worry if you miss it in the chat today. This question is for Josh. Does Mass Audubon have a tree nursery and can it provide reasonably priced trees for underplanting?
We don't have a tree nursery, unfortunately. That's something we've talked about establishing because it really is a need. There are certainly commercial growers that grow native plants and can provide native plants for planting, but there's not enough capacity currently in the state to really fulfill the need, and that's something that we've been talking about and may have in the future.
Okay, this one is for Melissa. Do any open space plans include light policies to limit pollution? And additionally, do the plans for parks include outdoor light specifics?
Yeah, great question. At the planning level, we're not discussing that directly, but we are subject to our lighting ordinance, and certainly we hear repeatedly throughout the year, and particularly over the past couple of years with COVID and then the change in the seasons, requests for keeping lights on longer in parks, understandably. So it's something that's being handled at the city manager level. I think there's a lot of strong opinions on both sides of that, but we're not addressing that specifically in this planning process.
All right, thank you. I think we only have time for 1 to 2 more questions. So this question is also from Melissa from Joanna. Although South Hadley is a tree community, many mature maples are being removed by private homeowners because of the cost of mature tree management. Are any communities providing subsidized tree management services to not make the lowest cost option the easiest option?
I think that was I think Joanna was able to vocalize that question earlier.
There is a possibility. We can
But
ask a different one
I'll
then.
look at if Joanna has one.
Yeah, I didn't really hear any specifics about money being made available or free services being made available, because the cost of tree maintenance, successive types of tree maintenance really just cause a lot of people to take down beautiful, huge trees.
Yeah, and it's a tough problem because again, this city can't provide direct aid to an individual. So there are solutions in grant program development that we have done, but I do know that in not in this case, in other examples, and continuing to look through case law and stuff and figuring out opportunities, how grant programs can be used to help provide maintenance for private property owners. But it is a challenge because we have to obviously can't give direct aid to individuals. But yeah, I understand that. If anyone else knows of any examples, we'd love to hear of it as well.
All right, so it's 1:28, and with that, I'm going to thank Josh and Melissa so much for your participation and your amazing presentations. And I just have one more slide for some closings before we take a break for our networking session. All right. All right, so thank you so much to our speakers and thank you to all of our participants for coming. We ask that you please fill out the short webinar evaluation form that Julia is going to be sending in the chat right now. Next week will be the fourth and final week of our conference. Week 4 is the financial context of your community. We will be joined by 2 fantastic speakers, Alexei Kalinin, a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard Forest, and Jonathan Thompson, a senior ecologist at Harvard Forest. This webinar aims for attendees to gain a better understanding of how conservation impacts town finances to help inform community discussions about conservation. Don't forget to follow us on social media to stay up to date with the Open Space Network.